Hi, it's Rhiannon from the Epsom Bakehouse, and today I'll be talking all about 3 quick tips to either speed up or slow down the rate at which your sourdough bread dough rises. If you're enjoying these videos and you'd like to learn more about baking your own great bread at home, you can sign up for my top 5 bread making tips via the link below this video. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about baking your own sourdough bread, and in particular the speed at which your dough rises. Now, you may well know that sourdough bread baking is something that can take a couple of days. And don't worry if you want to get started with it. You aren't busy in the kitchen throughout that period. But there are a couple of key things that will affect how quickly or slowly your sourdough bread dough rises. The first is temperature. And this is pretty true actually of most bread doughs. The yeast in your sourdough, which come from your starter, this is mine here, they will work more quickly at a warmer in temperature. Now, that's not to say that you should be trying to get your dough really warm, especially when making sourdough, because actually leaving it to rise for a longer period can make for more delicious and more digestible bread. But if you really find that your sourdough breads aren't getting going, the dough's really not rising, or even when you're at the stage of making your starter and it's just not getting bubbly, do check that you're not leaving it somewhere really cold and it's just not getting going. There's not that much yeast in here. It's a less concentrated population of yeast than if you were using commercial dried yeast. So you really need to give them a chance and make sure they're working at an optimal rate. So if you're struggling to get a dough going, or if the starter isn't getting bubbly, maybe try moving it to a slightly warmer place. Don't put it in the sun, on a radiator, on top of a boiler. All of those things will dry it out, but just somewhere a bit warmer in your house if that's possible. You might have found recently, especially here in the UK, we've been having lots of hot and sunny weather, so that's not really a problem. But if you're baking those sourdough breads when it's much cooler weather in wintertime, then you might just want to bear that in mind. The temperature will really affect how quickly your dough rises. The second thing that can really affect how quickly your sourdough rises is actually the amount of starter that you put in. This is my starter, and if you did my recent challenge, you'll know that I made this out of rye flour, and what happens is you allow the natural yeast to flourish in here and make bubbly starter. It's producing gas that rises your bread. So it kind of stands to reason that you can actually slow down how that dough rises by putting a little bit less when you're making your dough. So you can hold back on the starter and make a much slower and gradually built dough. This is one of the key things I was teaching in my recent membership class about baking sourdough bread. That if you want to, you could add a bit more, especially if it's a new starter, and really get your dough going. But once this is established as a starter and it's got a good and healthy population of yeast in it, you can probably bring it right down how much starter you put in and instead extend slightly the time that your dough takes to rise. A third factor that can have an effect on how quickly your dough rises, or indeed how your starter gets bubbly, and this is more applicable to the starter, is actually if you make your starter a little bit thicker. And by that I mean put more flour in when you're feeding it rather than water, or less water. You can probably see in my starter that this is quite liquid. It flows quite easily around this jar. And that means that the yeast, when they're in it, can swim around and they can get access to more fresh flour, especially when it's just been fed. This one hasn't, it's just out of the fridge. But if it's just been fed and it's quite a liquid starter, the yeast will have more access to food. They'll get digesting that flour more quickly and feed on the sugars, and they'll start producing gas. And so that can really help, especially when you're trying to establish a starter and you really want the yeast to get going and start producing that carbon dioxide gas to raise your dough. However, you might find that later on your starter has a colony of yeast that are so effective that whenever you feed them, they're chomping far too quickly and you're missing the point where your starter's bubbly and ready. So to slow it down, you might want to feed it with a bit more flour and a bit less water and make a thicker paste, and you'll find that the yeast will digest that flour more slowly and they'll get bubbly a bit less. So you can just control the timings of it a bit more easily. So I've talked today a little bit about speeding up or slowing down your sourdough bread dough rising, or making your starter more bubbly. 3 factors that can really affect that. And I'm certainly not suggesting that you're trying to speed up and get your sourdough bread made within 4 or 5 hours. That's not the case. But it's more about getting your timings that work for you in your life, and so that you can fit your sourdough bread baking around whatever else you're getting on with. So if you know, for example, that a higher temperature will speed up slightly the activity of the yeast, or obviously the opposite, that if you put it into the fridge, a cooler temperature will help slow down your dough rising and give you more time between the activities of, say, shaping and baking your bread, That really is a bonus for you. As well as temperature, you've also got the possibility of slowing down your starter by making it a bit thicker with more flour or less water. And then when you start making your dough, you could use less or more starter to help rise your dough a little bit more quickly or more slowly, just to suit you. It's just playing around with those kind of variables that can really help you fit sourdough baking around your life. There are long periods where you don't have to do anything when you're baking sourdough. The dough does the work for you. So make the most of that. As mentioned, if you'd like more bread making tips, you can, of course, sign up for my email bread making tips via the link below this video. And if you'd like to know more about the recent sourdough bread baking classes I ran in my monthly membership, the Bakehouse Club, then do get in touch or find it on my website. The link is below. Otherwise, I'll say happy baking, and I really look forward to chatting more bread making tips with you again soon. Bye!